for introducing yourselves. Um, I hope that you can understand from everybody's background the wonderful tapestry that makes up the nation of America, and especially this community. Um, this community is like a mini United Nations, and that's something about which I am very proud. That this is a community that, like the nation of America, in a way represents the entire world. Now, on the topic of U.S. immigration, I want to explain first why I first became interested in this topic. Now, when I was a young lad in middle school with a burgeoning interest in politics, imagine that, Sunhyun, with just a burgeoning interest in politics rather than a massive one. I remember following the 2008 election. That was between Barack Obama and John McCain. Now, at that time, illegal immigration had reached record levels. Maybe not record in the entire history of the U.S., but record at that time, yes. And this was a big issue going into the election. It was something that was talked about a lot. Imagine that, an election where U.S. immigration is one of the top issues. Sounds familiar. And both sides, I was really inspired because both sides said, okay, here's what we're going to do. Both Obama and McCain said, we're going to enforce our laws. We're going to secure the border, and we're going to make legal immigration less crazy and Byzantine and make it easier to come in as a legal immigrant so you can work here and contribute to the society. Both sides promised that. So I was like, yeah, no matter what happens, immigration policy is going to be fixed, right? Very naive. Here we are 16 years later. Neither of those things has happened, even though both presidential candidates in 2008 promised us that that's what they would do. And in fact, in 2008, Barack Obama won, and the Senate, he was controlled by the Democrats with 60 members of the Senate. That's called a supermajority. If you have 60 members in the Senate, you can bypass the filibuster. Does anybody not know what the filibuster is? Okay, so there are two houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. In the House of Representatives, if you've got a majority, you can pretty much vote to get any piece of legislation on the floor and vote on it. The Senate is different. In order to bring a piece of legislation to the floor to vote on it, you need 60 votes to get that done. So that means that a minority in the Senate can kind of block the process. If they have at least 41 votes, they can block the process of legislation getting passed. But in 2008, the Democrats held both houses, both the House of Representatives and a supermajority in the Senate, and they did not pass any meaningful immigration reform. Now, before you think that I'm going to come down on the side of the Republicans here, I'm definitely not. There are many cases where the Republicans have also blocked meaningful, at least moderate improvements to immigration reform. Not to mention immediately preceding the 2008 election, when President Bush tried to get meaningful U.S. immigration reform through multiple times, passed the Senate, blocked in the House by the Republican-controlled House of Representatives. So both sides have a history of not acting or blocking the meaningful improvement and reform of U.S. immigration policy. And so starting as a young lad, middle school, 2008, that's when I first started getting interested in this topic. Also, my mother is an immigrant who came to this country on a student visa. And then she got married here. She met the church, got married to an American, and became a citizen. And it was actually very, very difficult for her to stay here. She almost had to go back to France for 3 years, even though she was married to a U.S. citizen. And my parents had to apply to the immigration agency for a waiver. And the waiver that they requested was because my mother was getting older. She was into her 30s, and her doctor said, if she doesn't start having children now, then it may be difficult for her to do so in the future. And so because of that fact, she was allowed to stay. But she almost didn't stay. And I might not be standing here if that one immigration officer hadn't had, heart and granted that waiver. So my very existence here today is the result of U.S. immigration policy. All right. So, thank you very much. I wanted to go over some basic legal immigration terms to help frame our conversation. Now, you can take a moment to read them. Legal permanent residence, legal status authorizing an immigrant to live and work in the United States indefinitely, a prerequisite for U.S. citizenship. Green card, document denoting legal permanent residence. An immigrant visa, document issued abroad to authorize travel to the U.S. border to receive legal permanent residence. And non-immigrant visa, also known as travel visas. These are meant for those wishing to temporarily come to the United States for tourism, medical treatment, business, temporary work, or study. Okay. That is correct. Student visa is a non-immigrant visa. So there are two broad categories. Legally speaking, when we talk about immigration or immigrants, that is actually referring to people who are trying to come here and live here permanently, on a permanent basis, change their country of residence from one country to the United States. Everybody else is not technically an immigrant from the legal perspective. They are here on a non-immigrant visa. Now, does that make sense to everybody?
That would also be a religious worker visa.
Exactly.
For our members.
Yeah, many members came to this country originally on non-immigrant religious worker visas. And if you ask Irina Schneider after the presentation, she has a great story about getting into this country on one of those visas. Now, I wanted to go through some statistics to talk about legal immigration as it stands in this country today. This is not counting non-immigrant visas. This is focusing on the legal status of immigration. People get the idea that this country, because it's an immigrant nation, it must be actually very easy to come here as an immigrant. The opposite is actually the case. It's very, very difficult to come here as an immigrant. This figure is taken from David J. Beer, a presentation that he wrote for the Cato Institute. And this is a diagram representing the number of people who want to enter the US and the number of people legally permitted to enter. And this is using data from 2018, which is the latest year that he was able to find information for. So the first item on the diagram, those who want to immigrate to the United States, 158 million. This is based on survey data and is probably an overestimate. So of all the people in the world surveyed, do you want to leave your current country? They also asked those people, what is your top country that you want to go to, that you want to immigrate to? So all those people who said they want to leave their current country, and they said that their top country of choice would be the United States, that's where we get the 158 million from. Thank you. Do I need to plug this into my computer? Very good.
Oh, I just gave it to you the point
as a pointer. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you see that? Not really. I'll just gesture with my hands. Okay, so that is probably an overestimate. Many people who say they want to leave their country never in fact do, because it's a very lengthy, expensive process. You leave behind your friends and family. But that's a general estimate of how many people would like to come here. You can see it's composed of workers, families, and refugees. Now, the hard statistics.
These
Question?
are people who want immigrant visas, not non-immigrant.
Correct. These are people who want immigrant visas, permanent residence. Now, in 2018, 32 million people began the process of immigrating to this country. Of those, 24 million wanted to immigrate for work. 8 million were relatives of people who lived here, and 0.2 million, 200,000, were refugees. Of those who began the process, approximately 900,000 were permitted to enter legally. You can see here 200,000 workers, 700,000 relatives, and what is that? 20,000 refugees. Now, the issue, I want to call out the refugee number for a moment. The issue with refugee and also non-immigrant visas is that Congress has ceded a massive amount of power to the executive branch to determine policy on the subject of refugees and non-immigrant visas. And so those specific categories tend to be pretty, change a lot year to year, and it causes a lot of displacement. Those who want to immigrate as workers and families, that is governed by a congressional act, and there are specific limits put in place, specific quotas to fill. And it's focused especially on the relatives of those who enter. As you can see, the majority, 700,000, are relatives of those who want to enter. So the United States puts a cap. There's a cap on the number of immigrants that are allowed to enter each year. About 2/3 of that cap is approximately 700 to 750,000. 2/3 of that is reserved for relatives of permanent residents. 1/3 approximately is for everybody else based on a lottery system, especially prioritizing those countries that have fewer immigrants coming to this country each year. And then the last category would be refugees, who are the smallest amount and often gets to be cut back due to presidential action, as it was done in 2018 by Donald Trump. Okay, so that's the number of people who enter the country. So of the 32 million, less than 1/30 can enter. Next, I'd like to talk about legal immigration across the years in the United States. So this is 1788 all the way to 2020. Now, the gray lines are the immigrants in the number of millions, the gray bars. The blue line is the immigration rate as a share of the population. So over here, you can see that the number of immigrants was less than it is today, but as a share of the population, it was far, far more. So today is actually exceptional compared to the origin of this nation. I'd like to say that when this nation was founded, I'll get more into this later on the subject when I get into the history of U.S. immigration policy. When this nation was founded, the norm of European nations was to be incredibly restrictive for immigration, to restrict immigration into the country, and even those they do allow in, to absolutely not allow them to be citizens. The United States, when it was founded, took the opposite approach, that in fact the U.S. Constitution does not even enumerate a power to the federal government to restrict immigration. What it enumerates to the Congress is the power to regulate naturalization, which is the process by which somebody becomes a citizen. So the framers of the Constitution viewed it as an essential function of Congress to determine who has a citizen, who is a citizen, and who can vote. But it did not determine it to be a fundamental function of the Congress to determine who is allowed to enter. Thomas Jefferson actually said, there are many debates about the details of immigration policy in this country, but everybody agrees we need to grow as a country as quickly as humanly possible. The population of the United States at our founding was 2.2 million. Compare that to the Kingdom of France, whose population was 28 million at that time of citizens, and had an entire empire full of subjects who were not considered citizens across Africa and the Americas and the whole world. So we were just a fledgling third world nation, basically, 2.2 million, not a lot of wealth. We knew we had to grow if we wanted to stand up in this world. And when the United States was founded, it was the first country in the entire history of the world to be founded on the ideal of the consent of the governed and the rule of law. And the founders believed that this country had a mission from the creator to set an example of what countries could be in the future. And they knew that to fulfill that mission, they needed immigrants. The consent of the governed and the rule of law. Consent of the government means that the government can only act by the consent of the population, by the permission of the population. That the power of the government is derived from the people, not the other way around. So yeah, if you go to the Wikipedia article in the United States, it goes all into this about the unique nature of the founding of the United States. Okay, I'll get more into that later when I go back to immigration history, but I want to go to another chart. This is comparing the rate of immigration in the United States to other wealthy countries. The reason I chose wealthy countries is because those are the countries that will naturally attract immigrants, whereas non-wealthy countries are the ones who are actually, people are emigrating from those countries at a higher rate than immigrating. So most wealthy countries accept more immigrants per capita than the United States. The United States, if you count all immigrants, including illegal immigrants, it ranks 35th, and if you only count legal immigrants, it ranks 41st. So again, there's this idea that the United States is very welcoming to immigrants. Our current policy, as opposed to the policy that we had the founding of the nation, is actually quite restrictive compared to other countries around the world. And lastly, I wanted to show you the process of becoming a U.S. citizen. All right?
That's simple.
Oh, so simple. Now, sorry. I want to bring up my notes here for a second to make sure that I get this right. I just want to say that the most popular immigration law reference book is 2,656 pages. And its appendices contain nearly 300 pages of citations to thousands of statutes, regulations, memoranda, and legal decisions. Legal scholars say that the immigration policy in this country is second only to the tax code in terms of its complexity. So me standing up here trying to give you a presentation on U.S. immigration policy is about as difficult as trying to give a presentation on U.S. tax code. So, yeah, exactly. All right, so throughout this, you can see a bunch of blue boxes and a bunch of brown boxes. The blue boxes are questions for the person who's attempting to gain immigration. And then the brown boxes are decisions made by the U.S. government. And many of these are, oh, is our quota filled? And if the quota is filled, then you're not allowed in. So those green boxes are places where you may be eligible, and all of the red places are the places where you'll be denied. And you'll see that most of the paths lead to the denied. Since 1990, there have been 5 groups that have been allowed into this country, which I sort of referenced earlier. There's the refugee program. Qualified refugees have less than a 0.1% chance of being selected for resettlement, and only a few nationalities are even considered in the first place. So of the few nationalities that are considered, and of the people who decide to apply, less than 0.1% have a chance for being selected. Then there's the diversity lottery, which I referenced before. Diversity applicants, and that's based on national origin, so nations that tend not to send as many immigrants here. There's the diversity applicants who have a 0.2% chance of receiving a green card. And because the lottery excludes the top origin countries for legal immigrants, a majority of the world's population is ineligible to apply. For instance, India is a very popular place for people to come to this country. They are not allowed to apply under the diversity lottery. Then there's family sponsorship, which is actually the main way that people get into the country. However, aside from spouses, minor children, and parents of adult U.S. citizens, family sponsorships are capped at around 400,000 to 500,000 per year. The years of waiting caused by these caps mean that, except for sponsors of spouses and minor children of existing green card holders, most sponsors in these categories will actually die before their relatives can immigrate to this country. Then the 4th and 5th are based on employment. Employment-based self-sponsorship. These categories, so self-sponsorship, these categories are only for those who are, in legal terms, extraordinary, and that's a quote, have work of, quote, national importance, or can afford to make at least $800,000 in investments in the United States. Not options for many. And finally, there's employer sponsorship. This is an almost insurmountable barrier of bureaucratic red tape, which restricts employer sponsorship. And these restrictions exclude nearly all workers without college degrees, while low caps will result in many applicants dying before they can ever receive green cards. Employers make only 1 in 1,500 hires through this system. So my point is, immigration law is Byzantine, it's crazy, it makes no sense, and it's actually quite restrictive. All right, now I'd like to take a moment. This is the last diagram I want to show you. This is about illegal immigration and about how guest worker visas affect illegal immigration. Now, 1924 is the first year that these immigration caps were introduced. And so this graph only starts in 1944 because of that fact. And in fact, 1924 didn't even restrict immigration from the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't until the Great Depression that Congress passed acts restricting immigration from the Western Hemisphere because there were people who thought immigrants would be bad for the economy while we're trying to recover. Actually, the opposite turned out to be true. Restricting immigration, economists agree, prolonged the recovery of the Depression. But anyway, so starting in the Great Depression years, 1930s. Well, anyway, this starts in 1944. There are different periods of guest worker visas. So these are non-immigrant visas, like I mentioned at the beginning. These are not immigrant visas. These are non-immigrant visas for people who want to work here temporarily. As a result of what I mentioned, that passing of restrictions on Mexicans coming into the country during the Great Depression, a huge number of farmers who had ordinarily hired these people on a seasonal basis legally were now hiring them illegally. And so you saw a huge spike in the number of illegal border crossings, or rather, this is tracking Mexican apprehensions by border crossing enforcement, which is a good proxy for the number of illegal border crossings.
That's the number of people that were stopped. So that meant for
Yeah.
every one that got stopped, X number got through.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, in 1954, people realized that this was crazy, and they actually introduced a temporary something called the Bracero program, which meant that instead of all of these Mexican workers being assumed to be illegal, they were assumed to be legal and entitled to be here and work on a seasonal basis. And it reduced the number of illegal border crossings by a huge amount and increased the number of Mexican guest workers. And similarly, I don't want to get too much into this. I'd actually like to come back to this later, in fact. But similarly, different periods of deciding when Mexicans can have guest worker visas or not is directly correlated with the number of people crossing the border illegally. And I will point out, the main thing to take away from this is that border control has never, ever, ever worked effectively in those eras in which workers were not allowed to cross legally. It's just too many people to handle, okay? I'd like to draw a comparison to the Prohibition era. Trying to prohibit alcohol immediately turned millions and millions of Americans into criminals. And it fostered a organized crime around the industry of illegal alcohol. And it was impossible to enforce because it was just too many people you turned into criminals. And it wasn't until alcohol prohibition was repealed that that organized crime around the subject of illegal alcohol was actually able to be tamped down on. When you turn too many people into criminals all at once, there's just a never-ending deluge of enforcement needs that you can never keep up with, no matter how much money Congress throws at the subject. It just doesn't work. Okay. Now, I'd like to go into the eras of U.S. immigration. Okay. Like I mentioned at the beginning, during the colonial period, the powers in Europe very much focused on restricting immigration into their countries. They're very nationalistic, and they operated under an economic system called mercantilism, where individuals were viewed as assets of the government and moved around or enticed to move around to try to increase the wealth of the nation. So it was exactly the opposite of that idea of the consent of the governed. People were tools of the government. Many people left Europe at that time to come to America for a number of reasons. One is because they had no hope of economic prosperity back in Europe, and they wanted to take a chance in the Americas. Another reason was there was a policy called transportation, where if somebody was committed a felony and were on death row, they could choose instead to go to America as an indentured servant. Yes, to avoid the death penalty. Many people did that at that time. And then lastly, a huge number of people left Europe because of the freedom of conscience allowed in this country, where they could practice their religion as they saw fit in the American colonies. So there were many reasons that people came to this country. Another one that's important to mention is that hundreds of thousands of people, I think 300,000 or 400,000 people, were transported here as slaves from West Africa. No, total during that period. Yeah, during the colonial period, yeah. And those people's experience was completely different from every other immigrant experience because even though people came here as indentured servants, which was a form of servitude, there was the hope of escaping that one day with enough years of labor. The people who were brought here as slaves had no hope of freedom, and also their children had no hope of freedom. So it was a completely different class of people. I wanted to bring that up, but it is outside the scope of this presentation, which is about immigration. But those people came here and they were not considered immigrants. They were considered property. Now, during this time period, the American colonies wanted their population to grow because they needed people to be prosperous. They recognized that fact. There are two things that make any nation or any community prosperous or powerful. Those are population and wealth. The reason that population leads to greater prosperity is because human beings are productive creatures. That's the first principle of economics. So every human being who can produce, that you add to your population, they add to the overhead amount of excess productivity. So each human being is able of producing more than they consume. And that's why every additional human being can make your country or your population more wealthy. So during this period, the colonies wanted to grow their population. However, in about the 25 years before the Declaration of Independence, Britain viewed this as a threat to their power, that the colonies were becoming too powerful. And so they curbed immigration into the US colonies. And this upset the colonists so much that actually when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, one of their grievances was that Britain was restricting immigration to the United States. So they were very, very, very upset by that fact. Then,
There was a big intellectual brain drain immediately when the colonies got started.
yeah,
It was huge. Yeah. People, because of conscience.
right. So when the US finally did achieve its independence, they adopted a policy of open borders. There was no border policy. There was no border control. Border control wasn't invented until 1924. However, there was also no welfare state. So if you came to this country, you had to work, you had to find a place to live, you had to fend for yourself. And so the people who came to this country immediately had to start contributing. And so the new nation felt no need to restrict immigration. People could come here and work if they wanted to, become citizens if they stayed here for a certain number of years. And any problems of criminality could be dealt with by local law enforcement. And also at border crossings during this period, at ports and things like that, they did try to screen for a few categories, things like health, things like being a criminal from your country of origin. But there were a few specific things they looked for, and if you didn't match any of those, you were allowed to come in. So I like to think of it was a policy of like innocent until proven guilty. Okay, so unless you matched some sort of specific criteria, you were allowed to come into this country. A lot of various small squabbles happened during this period, but for the most part, there was pretty much an open border policy. The period from 1830 to 1917 saw major waves of immigration. If you go back to this graph, you can see the major waves of immigration started around 1830, and there were these 4 or 5 huge peaks that occurred during this period. And this was a time period when the United States saw huge population growth. Actually, from the origin of this country until the modern day, approximately 100 million people have entered the country as legal immigrants or gained legal immigrant status after coming here on a visa or something like that. So it's been a huge part of the growth of our country. Again, when we attained our independence, we were 2.2 million people. Now we're the third most populous country in the world, 330 million. And so the funny thing is, every time there was a major wave of immigration, there were always people who were getting upset and complaining that this latest batch of immigrants is not like the previous batch of immigrants. Like the previous batches were great. These ones, they're all like uneducated and poor. And the reason that they were poor is because they didn't have opportunities back home. That's why they came here. But fortunately, during that time period, there was a philosophy of restraint in government. So even though there were these anti-immigrant sentiment came up time and again, it didn't result in like a blockade on U.S. immigration. And so the country was able to grow. And there's no way that the country could have become the powerful country it is today without these waves of immigration. Now, one big exception to this idea of open borders that I'd like to bring up during this period of the major waves of immigration is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which restricted anybody from the specific country of China from entering the country. Now, 22 years earlier in 1861, the ambassador to China under Lincoln negotiated a trade deal with China. And actually, China in 1861, up to the point of that trade deal, restricted immigration out of the country, restricted emigration out of China and into the U.S. They did not allow their citizens to come to the U.S. But the ambassador to China drafted a trade deal, and part of that trade deal, he forced the Chinese government to allow their citizens to come to the United States if they wanted to, because this ambassador believed in the principle that immigration and free trade is good for both countries. And so as a result, there was this, the floodgates opened because all of these people were not allowed to come for a long period of time. Floodgates opened and Chinese people started coming, especially into California. And so there was a period of time where Chinese immigrants were like a major block of the population of California. And as usual, this created there was always a reaction to a huge new number of immigrants coming. And the difference being that unlike previous cases of like anti-immigrant sentiment, this happened in a state that happened to be a swing state. And sociologists view California of that period of the 1880s as potentially the first swing state in the political history of the country. And so there was massive anti-Chinese sentiment in California. Nowhere else in the country had that sentiment. But because both national parties wanted to win the state of California for their presidential elections and to sway the balance of power in the Senate and the House of Representatives, this became a national issue. And then both parties started to try to compete with each other to up the anti-Chinese rhetoric. And eventually the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was passed with almost universal support in the Senate and House. Now, as bad and terrible as that was, the thing that makes that different from the later Immigration Act of 1924 is that it was still a specific restriction. It was still, people were allowed to come unless they were from this specific country. In 1924, things changed completely to the opposite, where unless we specifically allow you to come, you are restricted from coming. So that happened, fast forward to 1917, during the Immigration Restriction Acts of 1917, 1921, and 1924. Okay, so this is the big one. And this is actually, my father wrote his doctoral thesis on the topic of these three Immigration Acts, especially the Immigration Act of 1924. So around the turn of the 20th century, there was a new political movement called progressivism, and there was also a new scientific theory called eugenics. Eugenics was based on the scientific findings of Darwin, but it itself was a pseudoscience. The idea behind eugenics was that all human traits, including character, personality, work ethic, moral quality, were determined by your genes. And not partially, but almost entirely, that your genetics were your destiny. And today we call this perspective biodeterminism. But that became the prevailing scientific thought at the time. There was a scientific consensus that eugenics was true and that people's genes determined whether they would become a good person or not. And there were a bunch of pseudoscientific studies done at the time using the language of science, but none of the substance of it, to prove this idea. Studies of different heredities. For instance, there was one book studying two different lines that came from one man. One was his, legitimate line from his wife, and another was a line that started because of an affair that he'd had with some low-class woman. And that was called the Jukes and the Kallikaks. And basically, this person just wrote a bunch of propaganda about how great once the legitimate side was and how terrible the illegitimate side was. Interestingly, this book is still quoted today in some places. People don't remember the history or recognize that it was, politically, the book was politically motivated. And I actually found this book referenced in a presentation that was used at a level 2 blessing workshop. And so I removed it from the presentation when I gave it. The person didn't know the history. It was just a casual reference to it. But yeah, there's this huge history that we know almost nothing about. So this scientific consensus that some people are better than others, then people took this and tried to use this to prove that all of their prejudices were right, that the immigrants from Western and Northern Europe were genetically better than those from Southern and Eastern Europe, those from Africa, those from Asia. And so all sorts of government studies were funded to prove this fact. And scientists going back now see there was total dishonesty all over the place, where people would take data that didn't agree with them. For instance, they found that Western and Northern European immigrants from certain cities were consuming welfare at a higher rate. Then they sent that data back and said, you need to look at this data again, get it back to us. So they discounted some and chose others. And so they created a moral panic around the country, where people believed that this country, if we didn't protect it from the tides of bad genes, that it would be destroyed from the inside. And so this led to the Immigration Acts of 1917, 1921, and 1924. 17 and 21 were temporary, and then 24 made it permanent. What that Immigration Act did was it limited entrance to this country to on a per country basis. And the number of people allowed to come from a specific country, let's say Germany, was equal to 2% of the foreign-born German population from the census of 1890. Okay, so in 1890, how many Germans were living in the country? Not German Americans, Germans. People who were born in Germany were living in the country. Okay, 2% of that's how many can come in from Germany each year. And they did that for every single country. Why did they choose 1890? Because that was before the latest wave of immigrants had come. And their intended purpose was to keep the racial and national makeup of this country frozen in time. They said 1890 and forward, we want to keep it frozen in time to protect the genetics of this country. Okay, the other thing that they did was they created a huge machinery, the U.S. Border Patrol, the immigration offices, this huge machinery of state to enforce these new laws. Now, racist and nonsensical policies are nothing new in American history. The difference, though, was that in 1924, the policymakers had the absolute hubris to think that they could create this huge machinery of state and enforce this immigration policy effectively. And this was kind of riding off of the wave of the progressive political ideology of that time. Progressivism in the early 20th century is very different from progressivism today. They mean very different things. Progressivism of the early 20th century was incredibly racist and very much about trying to grow the size of the state so that you can control the people and make the future of the country what it ought to be, not what people want it to be. So I want to point this out. 1924, that is the birthday of the U.S. Border Patrol. It's now 2024, 100 years later. Now I want to return back to this. The success of the U.S. Border Patrol is atrocious. It has never worked in the entire history of the time that it's been in place. The only times it has worked is when everybody who was crossing the border was basically assumed to be legal, checked for disease, did a background check, and then you gave them a document. You made it easy to come over and work. So again, innocent until proven guilty. During those periods when Congress made temporary programs to allow that to happen, Border Patrol was able to do its job. In every other period, it failed, no matter how much money Congress threw at it. And we see that again happening today. It's just it's an impossible thing to try to enforce. And it's also completely antithetical to the principles upon which this nation was founded. The point about the point of this nation, if you read the opening lines of the Declaration of Independence, is that all men are created equal. We're not in some parallel universe where all men are created unequal and should be treated differently. All men, even if they're not citizens. The Constitution ensures the rights of every human being in the country, not just the citizens of the country. That's an important fact to understand. And the 14th Amendment of this country extends those protections to every person, regardless of race, creed, national origin. So the policy that we have of restricting immigration is fairly antithetical, in my view, to the founding principles of this nation. And also, from the perspective of a U.S. citizen, I have a right to associate with whom I want. That's one of the rights granted to me by the Constitution. And so preventing me from hiring an immigrant or preventing me from having an immigrant come and live with me, be my roommate, that's actually a violation of my rights as a citizen, if you think about it. My point is not that there should be no border laws. That's not my point at all. Obviously, for the purposes of national security and all those things, you have to defend your borders. But the fundamental difference that changed in 1924 was that we created a policy where people were allowed to come unless for some specific reason they weren't, to a policy where no one was allowed to come unless they were given a specific reason to come. And it was based on national origin, explicitly for the reason of protecting the racial makeup of the country. So this continued for 40 years until 1965, when things changed. In 1965, this was riding the wave of the civil rights movement, which was recognizing that eugenics was garbage science and people should be treated equally regardless of race. And so it was actually our guy from Massachusetts, Jack Kennedy, who wanted to change and update the immigration policy to make it no longer racist, no longer based on the 1890 census. He was assassinated before he could see that happen, but his vice president, who became the next president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, made it a reality. Lyndon Baines Johnson is the one who signed the Civil Rights Movement in the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and he's also the one who signed the updated Immigration Act in 1965. This was not a perfect immigration policy, far from it, but it was a vast improvement. The difference is, A, it abolished the national origins formula. So every country around the world was treated equally. Every country had exactly the same quota that people could come. And then secondly, it provided priority for people who were related to people who lived in this country, and it provided bypass. So if you are a U.S. citizen, then your spouse, your children, and your adult parents can come to this country and get permanent resident cards, and that will not affect the quota. So that's why, even though the quota each year is about 700,000, it's more like 900,000, closer to 1 million people that come, is because there's this bypass for U.S. citizens. So it was what's funny is the people who were passing it at the time had no idea how much it would radically change the number of immigrants coming to the country. They thought it was just like, okay, we're going to make the immigration policy less racist, and we're going to allow families to reunite, and it'll just be a small change. It was actually a massive change because of people would chain. There was kind of chain immigration. So if you get to this country with a green card, then you could bring your direct relatives, and then they could bring their direct relatives. And so it created this kind of daisy chain situation that allowed a lot of people to come, especially from Asian countries, which were previously heavily restricted, and from South America and Latin American countries. I want to point out here that the 1965 immigration policy, which is still largely in effect today with minor modifications, is also not fair. It doesn't treat people equally because it prioritizes, not by intention of the policymakers, but it prioritizes the relatives of those who have immigrated more recently. So if your ancestors came to this country 100 years ago, there's no way that you're going to have a direct relative back in your country of ethnic origin. So it actually switched the formula on its head, where old immigrants were now heavily selected against, and new immigrants were allowed to bring their family members over in much greater proportions. So this was extremely helpful for the U.S. because it allowed us to actually start bringing in immigrants again, which, as I mentioned before, is very important for national strength. But it is not a sensible policy at all. It has only achieved that end by accident. And again, it's not equal. It's not treating people equally. It's very unequal and very Byzantine, very complicated. So any questions about the history of U.S. immigration policy before I move on back to the present day for a moment?
I don't know what it was, but I know something. There's things called amnesty that have happened, right, under Ronald Reagan, where they kind of blanketly, because it affected a lot of our members at that time.
Right.
Illegally, and they just sort of across the board said 7 million. Like, we'll just make everybody legal, and then that will solve the problem.
That's happened like 6 times since 1924, because as I said, their policies are unenforceable. So whenever the population of illegal immigrants became so huge that it was just like unthinkable to get rid of them, it would be devastating to the economy. Finally, Congress would come together and do a temporary act where they would do some sort of amnesty or pass a bill giving these people a path to residence and citizenship. Right, or if they could prove that they've been in this country since before a certain date. So that's happened a bunch of times, and it's sort of the only way that this policy can actually work. And so there are many people criticize that as, like, promoting illegal immigration, which obviously it does. I mean, it does, but it was necessary because the policy is so unenforceable on its face. So to bring us back into the modern day, we're essentially under pretty much the same scheme as 1965, with only a few minor changes. This is pretty unsustainable because of the huge amounts of illegal immigration that are happening at the border. And we have a situation where our borders are not being defended or enforced. We have a situation where it's almost impossible to come here legally and work, even if a U.S. citizen wants to hire you. And this is not good for our national security or our national strength, and it's not good for the immigrants either, who come here undocumented and basically have a second-class lifestyle. So it's completely crazy, and both sides understand that. Both the Republicans and Democrats understand that, but they still don't do anything about it. My opinion on that fact is that the reason they are unable to act is because there's gridlock. There's a gridlock of special interests where if either party tries to pass immigration reform, they're going to be upsetting some special interest, whether that's the labor unions who don't like guest workers, or national protectionists who don't like trade with foreign countries because they think it weakens the U.S. economy, or there's the pro-immigration lobby and the anti-immigration lobby, who are both very well funded. So to do anything other than maintain the status quo, you're going to trigger these special interests to send money to your opponents. So there's sort of a gridlock. Now, when has immigration policy changed in this country for real in the last 100 years is when there was a huge national movement, a national consensus that the immigration policy needed to be changed. In the 1920s, that happened because everybody was racist and thought it needed to be restricted now. And so Congress acted. In 1965, on riding the wave of the civil rights movement, it was because everybody realized, wow, this policy is incredibly racist and terrible, and it needs to be changed now. And so it was passed with a sizable majority in the Senate and the House of Representatives. We need the same thing to happen again today. Just recently, a bill was passed by the Senate and then rejected by the House, trying to reform U.S. immigration policy. You can talk about whether that would have been a good bill or not, but the fact is nothing is getting passed. The status quo is maintained over and over again. So the only way this is going to change, the only way to break gridlock in Washington is for it to be so unpopular to do nothing that the politicians have to act, otherwise they're not going to get reelected. And that's sort of what happened in 1965. That's why the immigration policy was able to be incrementally improved. So that's the major takeaway for you all today, is we have to build a national consensus that the current immigration policy makes no sense, and a more sensible one would be better. I want to outline quickly what I believe that sensible immigration policy would be. First of all, recognize that our national strength is dependent upon the growth of our population and the growth of our wealth. Okay? The reason the United States is so powerful is because it has been an unstoppable engine of population growth and wealth creation. And that is because this country recognizes the value of an individual human being, to be free to pursue his or her conscience, to be free to pursue his or her happiness. And when you allow human beings, which, as I mentioned before, are the only things in the universe capable of creating something from nothing, creating value from nothing, when you allow them to be free, you create new wealth. And so this country has operated on that principle to more or less effect for 250 years. And that's why it's been this unstoppable engine. And also, it's been an unstoppable engine of population growth because, unlike every other major power when it was founded, it believed in the freedom of human beings, the freedom of human feet to go where human beings believe they should be, where they can pursue their conscience and pursue their happiness. So I believe these two things to be true facts about humanity, that human beings are endowed by their creator with unalienable rights, and that a human being has incredible value, and that all men are created equal. And because that's a true fact, and the United States follows that true fact with its fundamental principles, you allow human beings to be more productive here than any other time in history. In the long climb of human beings, from the swamps to the stars, there's been no other country as powerful or as productive as the United States. Nothing comes close. The United States of America, our national domestic product, accounts for 25% of the product of the entire world. So this country produces 25% of the wealth of the whole world. And our population is only 330 million. That's nowhere close to 25% of the population. There's only we grew from maybe like 15% in the 70s to now we're at 25% currently. There's only one other country in history that it ever reached 25%. And that country is the United States of America after World War II. So the only other country that can compete with the modern US in terms of economic output is the United States after World War II, when the rest of the world was lying in ruins. The rest of the world is not lying in ruins now, and we've reached 25%. That is like unfathomable. This is a very unique country. So I'm trying to make the point that from first principles, believing in humanity is the way that you unleash productive growth in any nation. And the United States of America believes in humanity more, at least its founding principles, more than any other country I've seen in the whole history of the world. So we can't abandon those principles just because we're scared of immigration. I want to make a point about national security, the welfare state, and law enforcement. The point of my presentation is not to open the borders up completely and just let anybody cross who wants to cross. My point is, if you create a reasonable path for legal immigration for people who want to come here and work, and you follow the principle of innocent until proven guilty, then you will not have an impossible enforcement burden on our board. So for the sake of national security, yes, I'd like to go back to what America had from 1776 all the way up until 1917, where Congress or the executive branch in certain cases will take specific measures to protect this country, to protect against disease. For instance, during the pandemic, immigration to this country was restricted under Title 42 to protect public health. I feel like that was a reasonable step to take. Now, it lasted too long, in my opinion, but it was at the time, it was a reasonable step to take. Or if another country is at war with us, or if another country is, intentionally sending people to this country to cause problems, yes, take specific steps to check that country more rigorously. Or I'm not saying have no national security policy when it comes to the border. I'm saying that our national security policy can be much stronger and more effective if we allow a path for legal immigration. Legal immigration for low-skilled, medium-skilled, and high-skilled workers. All are incredibly important to this country. On the subject of the welfare state, I want to point out that, as I mentioned, national strength is based on population and wealth. If you have a welfare state, as they do very much so in Europe, and as we partially do in this country, and you make that welfare state available to immigrants, you will certainly attract a lot of immigrants, and you'll grow your population by a lot. However, you will create an incentive for people to come to this country just to receive benefits and not to work, and those people will rapidly drain the wealth of your country. And so you'll be gaining population at the cost of wealth. And it will currently, I want to point out that immigrants consume welfare at a lower rate than the average population. That is the current situation. But in part, that's because the federal government has a policy that for the first 5 years of resident status, you have somewhat limited access to means-tested welfare. But with recent actions by the government to loosen those policies, and also many states individually are offering welfare and free money to immigrants, that will rapidly change. You can't, just because historically immigrants have consumed that welfare at a lesser rate than citizens, doesn't mean that will continue indefinitely into the future under a different policy scheme. And I do want to point out that is a fact. Immigrants do not consume welfare at a greater rate than citizens currently. But anyway, that's something that could become a serious problem in the future if you allow that to happen. So a sensible immigration policy will be one in which people are allowed to come here legally to work, but not allowed to consume welfare benefits of this country of any kind for a certain lengthy period of time. And that way you can avoid the problem of wrecking our country in the process of accepting these immigrants. There's no sense in wrecking your own household in order to accept people. You're not going to be doing anybody any good if you do that. In order for this country to remain a refuge for people who love freedom, it needs to be a strong country, and the economy needs to be operational. So, the last thing I want to talk about is law enforcement. All right, this country was founded on the principle of innocent until proven guilty. So, that means you need to enforce the laws, though. If somebody commits a crime in your locality, you have to apprehend them. You can't let them go free. There are many cities around this country which, unfortunately, have adopted a policy of not enforcing crimes. And in fact, in the city of not enforcing laws, in the city of San Francisco, if you steal anything under a certain threshold dollar amount, $900, then the city police force is instructed to not take any action. So you have people going into CVS and taking less than $900 of things and walking out. And so in response, the CVS stores and other stores have created like protective locking chambers within which the products are stored. And you have to press a button to get an attendant to come over and put something into your basket for you and like basically walk with you out to the register. This makes no sense at all. And so you have to enforce local laws. And if you do that, then you don't need to worry about immigrants creating a bunch of like criminality in this country. I also want to point out that the rate of violent crime among immigrants, even illegal immigrants, is lower than that of the average population. That's a current fact. But even so, if any immigrant commits a violent crime when they could have been stopped, when it was known that they were a criminal in their home country, that is still a tragedy. So background checks, enforce the laws, apprehend people who are actual criminals, but everybody else, let them be free to come and live and work in this country. Now, the last thing I want to point out is because we've had such a restrictive immigration policy for so long, if we just open the floodgates, that probably will cause a shock to the labor market. All right, I'm not an idiot. I understand that. So whatever sensible policy we adopt has to be one in which the caps are raised each year by a sizable amount until eventually they're done away with altogether. And then you can allow a natural rate of immigration to happen. And if there's any trouble in the future, you can take an action at that time. As shown in the original graph of immigration, legal immigration to this country, we have received far, far greater numbers as a percentage of the population than we have currently. And it was no problem at all for us because they were able to become productive members of our society because there was no welfare state at that time. So if we adopt a policy of immigrants not having access to welfare right away when they come, we can achieve the same levels of integration. I would also like to speak about integration of new immigrants and new citizens, but that's for another talk. I've already gone at length. I will point out that the political opinions of immigrants to this country rapidly fall into the mainstream of the United States. And especially once they achieve U.S. citizen status, they become indistinguishable, statistically indistinguishable from any other citizen of this country. So our country is actually very, very good at integrating people into the mainstream. It's one of the reasons we've been able to be an immigrant country for 250 years. Other countries are trying around the world and, in my opinion, doing a lot less of a good job as America at successfully integrating new populations. What was that? Right. Okay, so the final concluding point I want to make is a word to the conservatives and a word to the Democrats, or to the liberals. To the conservatives who want to conserve the current immigration policy, which is based on the machinery created in 1924. I want you to understand that that policy was passed by ultra big government, ultra racists who believed in the unlimited power of the government to determine the destiny of the country. So what you're trying to conserve is not the original intention of this nation. You're trying to conserve ultra big government, ultra racists' machinery of state. It's not a good thing to conserve. And as I've shown with the illegal immigration graph, it has never been successful at preventing illegal immigration unless there was a program in place to allow people to come to this country legally with worker visas. To the liberals, I want to point out that the idea of allowing people to come to this country and immediately receive welfare benefits is incredibly naive. And yes, a member of the audience said insane. That's one word for it. Not only will the wealth of the country be rapidly drained from that type of policy, the type of person that you are incentivizing to come here is not necessarily the type of person you want coming here. You don't want people coming here who are interested in receiving, who are only coming here for a selfish purpose. One of the reasons this country has been successful is because every immigrant who's come here, almost everyone, has come with a heart yes, to benefit, but also a heart to give back to America, and with a heart of gratitude. So you absolutely, liberals, you absolutely cannot extend welfare benefits and entitlement benefits to immigrants the moment they come. It's a nonsensical policy. In 2016, we had two candidates. Unlike in 2008, where both candidates were promising a sensible immigration policy and then failed to deliver, in 2016, both candidates were promising, in my opinion, pretty nonsensical immigration policies. On the one hand, you had Hillary Clinton, who said, we're going to extend protections for illegal immigrants so they can stay here as illegal immigrants, not be naturalized, not be granted legal status, but they're going to stay here as illegal immigrants, and we're going to give them access to the Affordable Care Act, to free health care. That's what she was campaigning on, immigration policy. On the other hand, you had Donald Trump, who was campaigning to build a border wall, send tons of money to the border, reduce levels of immigration, which I've already shown are actually quite small compared to the majority of wealthy countries around the world, wanted to reduce immigration. Now, aside from the fact that it is impossible to enforce that type of border policy, no matter how much money you spend, let's say, hypothetically, that during his 4 years he was actually able to do that, which he wasn't. He tried and failed to do that. If he were actually able to stop all illegal immigration to this country, you would actually see incredible economic harm, especially to the agricultural sector, which absolutely relies on immigrant labor from across the border. In many cases, illegal immigrant labor. If you cut that off without simultaneously providing a legal path to citizenship at the same time, you'll cause economic catastrophe in this country. So, unlike in 2008, 2016, we had nothing but bad choices. In 2024, I feel like we're kind of in a similar boat. There's a lot of talk about this, that, and the other. I haven't seen anything that seeks to reform the immigration policy from the ground up in the way that I'm proposing. But that's why it's so important to act locally and spread the idea. So, innocent until proven guilty, and no welfare. That's the basic principle, and those need to happen at the same time. Also, enforcement of the border. Sorry, that's the third prong. Innocent until proven guilty, no welfare, enforcement of the border. If you can pass all three of those at once, you'll have a phenomenal immigration policy. If you don't have all three, there's going to be pretty drastic problems, and it's not going to work. Okay, that's my presentation, everybody. Thank you for listening.
So I'd like to start our discussion. By the way, it's now 2:30, and we said this would be over 2:30.
Next, I'm going to get a discussion. Yes.
Okay, good idea. Thank you, thank you. But if anyone feels they got to run out the door, understood. That was the original time frame. Sunhyun talked for an hour. Oh no, it wasn't an hour. It's an hour and 20 minutes. But anyways, let's thank him again. But Sunhyun, don't go anywhere. I want to ask you. Okay, so we really appreciate that you came out with 3 recommendations. So the first one is the one I want to understand. You said innocent until proven guilty. I think what you said was, you put a lot of time in explaining this to us, that the current immigration policy it's very, very hard to get through all the hoops and interviews and requirements and limitations to legally receive an immigration visa. So what you're saying is change the philosophy of immigration. Make it easy to get an immigration visa. Is that what you're saying? Make it easy to go through the system legally. Yeah. So make the system, rather than making the system hard for even qualified people to get through, make it very easy to get an immigrant visa for this country. That's when you say innocent until proven guilty, you're saying that the underlying philosophy or attitude of immigration law needs to be inverted and give people the benefit of the doubt. So anyone who wants to immigrate here, who meets these reasonable criteria, is allowed to become a citizen of our country. Okay, interesting. I think because we're recording this, we need to, here's the mic, yeah.
People who have come from, especially from Haiti. The problem that that people coming in is they don't have work visa, so if they're not able to work, then they're stuck, so if you're not giving them welfare or some kind of immigration, some kind of monetary thing, and if they're restricted at working, then they're stuck, they can't do anything.
Right, yeah, that's a really good point. And the problem is that work visas are capped. There are caps to how many can be issued each year. And for instance, for scientists, those caps are so low that those caps are filled within the first 5 days of the U.S. calendar year. That's just one example. So yeah, you're absolutely right. If people come to this country as a refugee, but are then also not licensed to work, what the heck are they going to do? There's nothing, right? There's nothing but to be on the public dollar.
Thanks, Peggy. Yes, other. Please. Okay, here we go. I hate to say it, Sunhyun, but I think you got to stay. You need to sit down?
No, I can say that.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Before we really discuss about, we have to understand this. One is from God's viewpoint, how much God expect this nation to be prosper, and hope for the or entire globe. This nation is a hope for God. This is exactly that our Father is teaching. The other hand, I don't know, Catherine mentioned about amnesty. At that time, I have experience. I tried to get legal visa for many of our workers. And many immigrants under restriction, they are working without paying taxes. No income tax, they are not paying, they are just getting cash. And then employer also like to hire at less amount with paying taxes. Some job is prefer less employee and work more and less cheating sales, something. Those kinds of things that IRS does not want to. So if you report where you work and how much you pay for tax, income tax, this is a huge thing at that time when the amnesty was issued. If you report whatever you work and pay the tax, IRS is happy. So they make easy to legalize. This is a reality that government want pay the tax, but under illegal, the cash workers, this is always a problem. They are not doing anything for this nation, and no, hope for this nation, and he doesn't not happy neither.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a good point. If you are operating in the black market or the cash economy, then in a sense you're not really contributing to this nation. And so that's an example of what I mentioned. You have to have sensible laws that are actually enforced. And the current situation we have is we have nonsensical laws that are not enforced. Yeah.
So I think that I would like to just mention one of the principles I think in place here, Sunhyun is recommending, you brought up a key point, is that any immigration system has to be based upon the respect for the sovereignty of the country and respect for the rule of law. Is that?
I would agree with that.
Yes. Yeah.
I would say just one thing is that I think, I don't know, maybe there's data on this, but while there might be in that first generation some illegal stuff going on, probably by the second generation that go to school, that, you know, kind of have the opportunities, you have tax-paying citizens coming, you know, from that because they've seen how difficult the life was for their parents living that way.
I don't-
Unless as they're brought as illegal.
Unless they're
children.
right, exactly.
And that's a big problem
Yeah.
because they have no path
No path.
to become legal. Like in education, it's a big thing because we can bring them to graduation of the high school and that's it. They cannot do anything else. They cannot go to college and they're illegal. They grew up here. They don't know anything else. They don't even speak the language sometimes. But when when they were little and there were multiple attempts to do this Dreamers Act, kind of to give them amnesty, and it was stopped as well.
Yeah, on that topic, I don't have the data about the difference between first and second generation and rates of tax compliance and all of that. But what I do know is that for legal immigrants, the rate of compliance with laws is higher than that of the average population. And also they contribute more into Social Security and Medicare and other public programs than the average US citizen, and they take out less than the average US citizen. And this actually makes sense because if somebody comes to this country as an adult and starts working immediately, then the country where they came from paid for their first years of life when they were a dependent, and now they come to this country and are just productive until the time that they retire.
Yeah, so the election's binary. So if the election is held today, is it Biden or Trump?
Me?
Yeah.
I actually haven't decided yet.
Okay.
I'm an independent.
Okay. Independent.
You never know. The last time an independent party won, it was the Republicans, and they abolished slavery. So
As a Republic, because the old party, the Whigs, were going down. Like they were dying. That's why.
that's right.
So I don't know what was the actual story that I think it was at the end of last year or early this year when, as you said, the Senate had the votes to pass some kind of immigration reform. But the way it was explained is that even the House was going to go along with it until Trump said, don't do it, because they want it as an issue. What was that immigration law? Was that a step forward or was it just...
That
Do
is
you
a
know?
good question. I am not completely aware of everything that was in the bill. What I do know is that it was a very large bill, which included many provisions outside of the subject of immigration. And so that created cover for people to, in the House who wanted to reject it, to say that it was because of this reason or that reason or the other reason that they wanted to reject it. I couldn't say, it was a very complicated bill. And the patchwork of, it would have added to the patchwork of complicated immigration laws. So it's really hard for me to say what would have happened if it had been passed. But I've heard some people I respect at various institutes say that it would have been at least a marginal step in the right direction. But I couldn't say for sure.
I think a big part of it, isn't it true that a big part of the money was for improving border protection? It was very much of a compromise with a heavy emphasis on border protection. So I think based upon the recommendation that Sunhyun's made, it didn't really change any of the underlying problems with the system.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm glad I have you as an interpreter. By the way, Seiken, if you want, I would love to talk to you about that question of the 2024 election later. But for this presentation, my answer is I'm undecided. But I'll talk to you later, one-on-one.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah.
You're probably dying to sit down and I'm going to ask you. Maybe this will be the last question. All right. Sunhyun, thank you very much. I learned a lot, and I really like your proposal.
Yeah.
I think you've really made a contribution. Thank you. Um, sometimes I wonder if there isn't a malevolent aspect to this in which there are some people for whom this current immigration regime they believe it helps to undermine the sovereignty of our country and undermine the rule of law. And therefore, for some political agendas, there's a benefit to the current chaos. But I'm wondering if that's just a figment of my imagination, or if you've come across that kind of current in your reading.
I can rephrase it.
Okay.
Basically, Mr. Edgerly is asking if there is a portion of this country who wants the immigration policy, nonsensical and unenforced as it is, to remain in place because they believe that this will undermine the United States of America, and they view that as a good thing. They view the United States of America as an enemy to goodness or an enemy to the world. Here's what I will say. Number one, among the general population of the United States, that is not a dominant prevailing idea. Actually, the majority of people essentially agree with two of the basic proposals in what I'm proposing, which is simplify the path for legal immigration and secure the border. That's the majority of people want that kind of sensible idea. They don't understand, because of how complicated immigration is and because of the whole history, they don't understand the history, they don't understand how difficult it is. So the general consensus is not aware of that fact, so it's not able to push it through Washington. But they do accept those basic ideas. What I will say is that there is a small percentage of people who do say what you have said. There are people who say that, a small percentage of people who believe that the United States is an enemy of goodness and that it needs to be changed from the inside. And therefore, for the U.S. to have any immigration policy would be a bad thing. It should just let anybody in who wants to come and change the nation in any way they want.
Is that people who feel what needs to be changed is
Get
white male privilege, supremacy, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that kind of thing.
So,
Yeah. Get
so
rid of the whiteness.
flood the country with non-white people,
Right, yes, essentially.
which is what our movement has done.
Right. I want to make one struck from the record. Okay. One thing I will point out is in Canada, the Prime Minister has a slogan, an immigration slogan called "Diversity is our strength." From my perspective, I do not think that diversity is the main reason to have legal immigration. The main reason is humanity. So I am pro-humanity before I am pro-diversity. Every human being is divine and has unique, eternal, cosmic value. And so if you want to come here, I don't care whether, me personally, I don't care whether you're white or black or brown or orange or blue or green. If you want to come here and you want to work, then you should be able to come here. That's my opinion.
Let's give another round of applause. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming, and we're really happy to have everyone here and for all the research that Sunhyun did. And I hope you can be here in 2 weeks when we're talking about two alternative perspectives on who is Donald Trump. Thank you.